All right. Hello, everybody. Wireless, here we go. Hi, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming. On behalf of Busboys and Poets, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion with Dr. Ibram Kendi about Chain of Ideas. Our Busboys and Poet servers will be throughout the room tonight taking orders during the program. A quick little PSA, our AC system might cut on at some point, giving you a little shocking loud noise, but maybe you won't be, but just want to let y'all know. And also reminding you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion. So make sure that you are preparing your questions throughout the presentation. And there will also be a book signing after the event. We do have copies of Chain of Ideas right out at this table, which will be going on during the event and also after event. And getting into an author introduction, Dr. Ibram Kendi is one of the world's foremost historians of racism and a leading anti-racist scholar. He is the Carter G. Woodson Endowed Chair in History at Howard University, HU. Yeah, and and the inaugural director of Howard's Institute for Advanced Studies. In total, Dr. Kendi has published 18 books for adults and children, including 12 New York Times bestsellers, 5 of which were the #1 New York Times bestsellers. Time magazine named Dr. Kendi one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Grant. So let's go ahead and give a warm welcome to Dr. Kendi for this talk tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I am truly honored to be here with each of you. Thank you so much for coming out. It's always an honor to be in this space, in this hallowed space, Busboys. And so I want to thank Andy and his colleagues for opening the doors for me to talk to you about this important book, and hopefully it'll sort of spark a larger conversation. Before I begin, I actually have a few colleagues here with me, and I wanted them to raise their hand. Daniel, who works at the Emancipator, Lima, who works at the Emancipator, and my assistant, Arrington. I'm really nervous. I was telling them beforehand, because if I bomb this, I know they're going to talk about me on Monday. So hopefully I'll do okay. But I am excited to of course, to be with you. I don't know if you saw the news today that the so-called racial realist who instigated the media lynching of Jason Arday was suspended from his university in Belgium. And I wanted to start out talking about that because this was a person who was a fellow at Cambridge when Jason Arday was hired in 2023 to pretty sizable fanfare because he was the youngest Black professor in the history of this very old university. And so I can imagine, someone like Coffness, who believed that Black people were intellectually, genetically inferior, and who ultimately believed that if there was a true meritocracy, that Black people and even women would not exist in any high-profile positions, was quite taken aback when he saw the news that Jason was coming to his university. And in fact, he probably took it a step further and imagined that the hiring of this Black professor represented his opportunities being taken away. And indeed, a year later, when he wrote a blog post asserting that both Black people and women were genetically, intellectually inferior, and ultimately he was let go, it almost sort of reinforced for him this notion that apparently white people, but particularly white men, are under attack, are being replaced, are being displaced, and that they need to fight back. And of course, we know how he decided to fight back, which was to ultimately run Jason's thesis and other materials through a plagiarism machine, and ultimately wrote a blog post, or I should say a Substack post in July, asserting and alleging plagiarism, which ultimately led to this media firestorm, in which the UK media published 249 articles on Jason in 22 days. And meanwhile, we actually reported at The Emancipator that the US media, just 15 media organizations, published 30 pieces in the 12 days before Jason's death, and another 35 after his death, one of which was in The Atlantic that was titled Jason Arday's Final Self-Delusion. Another in the New York Post that stated that wokeism killed Jason Arday. I wanted to open with this because I think in many ways, Confidence, who triggered this media lynching, believed an idea that actually is being believed by people throughout Europe, throughout the United States, and frankly, around the world. And that idea is what I write about in Chain of Ideas, which is what's called Great Replacement Theory. And I end up defining this theory as this political theory that suggests that there are these globalist elites who apparently are enabling peoples of color to displace the lives and even livelihoods and even electoral power of white people. And because of that, apparently, white people need authoritarian protection. And so the notion, for instance, that Black and brown immigrants are invading the nation, that's an example of Great Replacement Theory. The notion that Muslims are internal enemies, that's another manifestation of Great Replacement Theory. Or even the notion that diversity, equity, inclusion programs are anti-white, are about stripping white people of opportunities as opposed to providing opportunities for disadvantaged groups. That's another manifestation, of Great Replacement Theory. And what I also document in Chain of Ideas is that even as this theory started out as a racist idea, it actually has mutated. It's mutated to not just say that there's this war against white people who apparently are the primary victims of racism, according to Great Replacement theorists, but it's also mutated to say there's a war against men. It's mutated to say there's a war against Christians. It's mutated to say there's a war against quote unquote Judeo-Christians, which is an interesting idea to anyone who knows Jewish history, right? Because of course the Christians have been the primary persecutors of Jews. It's mutated to suggest that there's a war against heterosexuals. There's a war against cisgender people. Apparently all 10 of those trans folks playing college sports have completely taken it over, right? It's mutated to say that, frankly, any ethnic majority is under attack. And because of those mutations, it's allowed for this theory to frankly be used by authoritarian politicians all over the world. And so right now, in this moment, not only the president of the United States ran on great replacement theory, but the prime minister of India runs on great replacement theory. The most popular, the president of Argentina, the president of Chile, the former president of Brazil, the current president of El Salvador. I mentioned, of course, India, the president of Chile, I should say China. And let's go to Europe. The most popular politician in the UK, Nigel Farage, is a great replacement theorist. The most popular party in France, the National Rally, articulates great replacement theory. The most popular party in Austria, which was founded by former Nazis, is articulating great replacement theory. The former prime minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, was a great replacement theorist. The current president of Russia has positioned queer people apparently as taking over and displacing the lives of Russian Christians all over the world. You have these powerful politicians who are pushing this theory. And what's also striking is all over the world, these politicians are saying to everyday people, I am your defender. Meanwhile, they're being financed by the wealthiest people in their nation. Just as it's happening in this country, where the wealthiest person in this country, and frankly around the world, pumped $250 million into the last election. And so why would wealthy people, why would the super wealthy, why would the billionaire class be wanting so many people to believe great replacement theory? Why would they be seizing control of social media platforms? Why would they be taking over television networks? Why would they be gobbling up local television networks? Why would they be buying newspapers like the Washington Post and others? Why would they be doing this? Well, because it gives them the ability to spread great replacement theory. But why? Why would they want great replacement theory to be believed by so many people? Because they know folks are struggling. They know folks are struggling to find jobs. They know folks are struggling to gain access to that opportunities. They know. And so the question becomes, who are everyday people going to blame for why they're struggling? So if you can get people to blame those folks who don't look like them for why they didn't get that job, as opposed to the person who literally eliminated the job, if you can get that person who doesn't love like them to believe that they didn't get that promotion, right? If you can get that person to believe those folks of the religion is the reason why they don't have access to that opportunity, what are you going to have? You're going to have a society where the people you're dominating are literally turning on each other, which makes it easier for you to what? To dominate them. Sorry, I got all riled up. I didn't mean to. What's also striking about great replacement theory is that I document certainly its recent emergence. The term great replacement was coined by a French novelist named Renaud Camus. And I talk about his book that was called The Great Replacement, that was published in 2011 in French. And how that book, but more specifically that term, became the name for an idea that actually had long existed. And so ideas are different than humans. Most of us, we get our names around the time we're born. Ideas can live for decades, if not centuries, before they're named. And indeed, great replacement theory had a long life before Camus named it in 2011. And I want to y'all mind if I read a quick passage from the book? And I want to talk about one area where great replacement theory was used. And let me sort of preface this with, I'm going to go back to Nazi Germany. And I think it's important for me to convey that Nazism has its own prehistory. And that prehistory, of course, to a certain extent begins with people like Madison Grant, who wrote a book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race. And Madison Grant was a New York conservationist and eugenicist. And this book became what we would now call a bestseller. And it ended up being translated into multiple languages. One of those languages it was translated in was German. And it ended up arriving in the jail cell of someone by the name of Adolf Hitler, who ultimately called this book by this New Yorker my Bible. And that book was more or less a treatise on great replacement theory. But of course, we know the story that Hitler and other Nazi theorists took this idea to a whole nother level. And so I write in the prologue, so I'm going to read a passage from the prologue, and I'm going to read a passage from the end, because as a reader myself, I don't want to give away too much. So in the prologue, I write, according to the received history, Nazism died when Hitler died, and Nazi Germany fell in 1945. And in their wake, something new was born, neo-Nazism. Today, when we hear popular Nazi phrases like blood and soil, or encounter various forms of Holocaust denial, Hitler worship, Nazi salutes, and genocidal anti-Semitism, we call it neo-Nazism. But there is nothing new, nothing neo about any of this. Isn't that just plain Nazism living on after 1945? What if neo-Nazism is truly something new? Neo-Nazism should be defined as a wholly renovated Nazism that retains the original political theories, premises, while adding new elements for new times. Great replacement theory is a neo-Nazi theory, replete with its many renovations. A politics of zero-sum blood wars, Nazi, renovated to a politics of zero-sum culture wars, neo-Nazi. Multiple bloodlines can't coexist on the same soil, Nazi. Renovated to multiple cultures can exist on the same soil, neo-Nazi. Ethnic inversion, Nazi. Renovated to ethnic substitution, neo-Nazi. Anti-Nazism labeled as cultural Bolshevism, neo-Nazi. Renovated to anti-racism labeled as cultural Marxism, neo-Nazi. The Jew as the alien enemy, Nazi. Renovated to the Muslim as the alien enemy, neo-Nazi. International Jewry striving to dominate the globe, Nazi. Renovated to globalist, striving to dominate the globe, neo-Nazis. Jews must be deported to safeguard Aryans from poisoning and annihilation, Nazi. Renovated to peoples of color must be deported to safeguard white people from poisoning and annihilation, neo-Nazi. The success of neo-Nazi great replacement politicians in the 21st century often hinges on the success of their most basic renovations, how completely they strip the core ideas down to their structure, while superficially decorating their political theory with new embellishments. The more they remove the Nazi underpinnings from view, the more they entice electoral support for their neo-Nazi project. Anybody watch is it HGTV? Sorry. So my mother is like, whenever she comes, like she just always has HGTV. Am I getting okay? She just always has that channel on, right? And it's typically like one of those shows where it's like they're doing these renovations on a house, right? In which they're completely stripping it down to its bone. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. Sorry. Y'all be watching it. Okay. So in which they're completely stripped the bones down. So you first go to the house and it looks terrible. Nobody would want to live there, right? So then they go in, they strip it down to its bones, right? Then they put new drywall, right? They furnish it. And then there's all these people who want to buy into that new house who would not have bought into it, right? If they would have seen it. When it first went on the market. I use a similar analogy to talk about how after World War II, Nazism looked like that terrible house, right? And over the last 60 to 70 years, these theorists, these neo-Nazi theorists have literally engaged in a serious renovation. And now, it has all new drywall. Now it has all new furnishing. Now it has even an open kitchen because they got to do the open kitchen. It has all these ways to entice people, and people don't know that they're walking into and buying a Nazi house. Preach. And I write, neo-Nazi Great Replacement theorists do not need to admire Nazis to be neo-Nazis, just as children do not need to admire their parents to be their children. Anybody know what I'm talking about? What matters is genealogy, a genealogy of theory and tactics. Even René Camus, who coined the term the Great Replacement, indirectly acknowledged this ideological genealogy. He had written at length about what he called the second career of Adolf Hitler. How, quote, all of the terms and ideas that were touched slightly or intensely by the phraseology of the Third Reich have become suspect, he complained. So too are those who use them. Camus argues that many of the terms and ideas Nazis used were indispensable to the protection of Europe. Deprived of them, he wrote, the continent is an open city. Camus imagined that Hitler's second career, the canceling of Nazi terms and ideas, will finish the job of white extinction that the Nazi leader's first career started. According to Camus, terms and ideas from the political theory that rationalize the gravest amount of white death and destruction in history are needed to prevent white death and destruction in the 21st century. Hitler branded himself as the protector of Aryan Europeans from annihilation, then set in motion a world war that killed perhaps as many as 45 million white European civilians and soldiers. When people can be made to believe that their slayers are their protectors and their likeliest allies are their slayers, an authoritarian age becomes politically possible. So if anybody is wondering how we arrived at this point, that's precisely how and why. And I really seek to lay it out in this book. The book, again, I'm not going to give too much away. The book, Chain of Ideas, is organized into 10 sections. Each section is set in a different country. And each section that's set in a different country revolves around the life of a different politician. And the US story and the president of this country is woven throughout the text. But I thought it was important for people to see the truly global scale of these ideas. And I think what's going to be striking for those of you who haven't read it is you're going to see talking points that are being used currently in the United States that started out in other countries. You're even going to see political scandals that emerged in other countries that come here. To give one example, do y'all remember during the 2024 election, it feels like so long ago. Do you remember the whole political eruption over cats, over immigrants? Apparently, Haitian immigrants apparently were eating cats in Springfield. Y'all remember that? I'm just trying to imagine like 200 years when people are writing about this era, like what they're going to say. But anyway, that's another conversation. So that same political scandal actually emerged in Italy. Italy, the current prime minister of Italy is a woman by the name of Giorgia Meloni. Giorgia Meloni's political party is called the Brothers of Italy. The Brothers of Italy was originally called the Italian Social Movement when it was founded in the 1950s. The Italian Social Movement took its name from something called the Italian Social Republic. Just follow me. The Italian Social Republic was the name of Mussolini's northern Italian republic that was more or less guarded by Nazi troops during World War II. So for those who aren't familiar with the story, like Mussolini at one point during World War II is sacked from office, is pretty much imprisoned. Then Nazi power troopers free him from prison and then set him up to rule northern Italy as this puppet leader. And then, of course, they bring in Nazi troops to guard him. And that republic was called the Italian Social Republic. So former leaders of that government then formed a political party called the Italian Social Movement. That is the same party with a different name, because of course, you know, the renovations, right? That is Meloni's party. And so prior to what happened in Springfield, I'm getting back to Ohio, there was a case in Italy in which a quote unquote African immigrant was accused of eating cats in an Italian city in the public area. And then Meloni's party used that to say, you see, we are being overrun and invaded by African immigrants and they're eating our cats. The same thing happened, right? And so Chain of Ideas is set all over the world. Some of the countries it's set in. The first section is set in France. And the political leader that it's set around is Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, founded an organization called the National Front in the early 1970s with former Nazis. She was the most powerful politician in France who wasn't prime minister until because apparently, like in France, if powerful politicians break the law, like they actually could be arrested and jailed. I mean, we don't know anything about that in America, but that actually happens in other countries. So the second country is set in is Hungary. and I think many of you have probably heard of Victor Orban. The third country it is set in is Chile. The current president of Chile is Jose Antonio Cast, and I'm not going to give away his story. The fourth country is the UK, and then it goes from the UK to the Netherlands. From the Netherlands, it goes to Germany. From Germany, it goes up to Canada. From Canada, it goes to Italy. From Italy, it goes to El Salvador, and ultimately Russia. And the book is also organized around these 10 ideas that formulate great replacement theory. And I just want to read one last passage, and then we can open it up for a conversation. And this passage is going to explain the final link in the chain of ideas, or the final idea that formulates great replacement theory. So, I mind if I read this real quick, and then we can. Okay. So, you have the mic. So before I get to this, I'm writing about how when Putin, because I think I mentioned this is I'm in section 10. When Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, Vladimir Putin asserts that he's invading Ukraine because Russians in Ukraine are being oppressed, are being persecuted. And he presents himself as their protector, as their savior. And so that's why he makes this case that he needs to invade Ukraine. The reason why this becomes critical is because what actually happened is particularly the eastern part of Ukraine, when Russia invaded and took over that area, ethnic Russians lost rights. You see how he claimed he was coming in to protect them, to elevate them, but in actuality, they lost rights. And I write about that. And I write about across the world, great replacement politicians convince people to crave the privilege of being a member of the ethnic majority, of being Christian, of being a citizen, of being male, of being cisgender, of being heterosexual, of being white. Crave the privilege of being deemed superior. Crave the privilege of embodying the nation. Crave the privilege of being identified as patriots even after invading legislatures. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Crave the privilege of being on the higher end of inequities, of being on the living end of hate. Crave the privilege of inflicting violence on disadvantaged groups and narrating this terror as self-defense. Great replacement politicians persuade everyday people to crave an inequitable dictatorship where they have limited power, but more privileges than others, rather than an equitable democracy where they have expansive power, but no privileges over others. Great replacement politicians do this by knotting the privileges individuals receive to their group identity. That is, they bond the very being of persons to their privileged identity in order to convince members of these privileged groups that to lose their privileges is to lose their very being, lose their very way of life, lose their life. These messages are utterly dehumanizing, even as members of privileged groups are told that they are the most superior humans. In this dehumanizing sense, who they are is not who they are. Who they are is what they have. What they have is the privileges that they have. The privileges to live longer than others, the privilege to have a better livelihood than others, the privilege to have more electoral power than others, the privilege to have more freedom than others. That's what it means, they are told, to be white or male or Christian or heterosexual or Hindu or another ethnic majority. They're supposed to crave their privileges at all costs, or rather, despite the cost to their power. They're supposed to support those dictators that protect their privileges at the cost of their power. It all amounts to the final link in the chain of ideas, fighting for privileges provided by dictators instead of power provided by democracy. Thank you.
We will go ahead and open up the floor for any Q&A questions. So I will come around the room with the mic if anyone has a question. Here we go.
Hello, thank you. My question is, given the information, I mean, I think it's good for us to be able to recognize what's happening, to be able to identify what's happening. My question is, like, what would you say for practical, just normal people? What is the practical application with knowing basically how racism and how these ideas are infiltrating our society? Like, what should we, on a just individual level, strive to do with the information?
So I didn't want to talk about the epilogue. But I want to give, can I give an example of a conceptual idea, which I think then can lead us to very practical things. If you as an individual believe that differing sort of racial and gendered and ethnic groups that there's this zero sum, that as this other group gains, your group loses. And then you believe that whenever you see one of them, quote unquote, ascending, you're literally losing out. And that you believe that you have to protect your group at all costs because apparently that's how you have, you're going to be able to be dominated and exploited and controlled pretty easily. And so that chain of ideas, I offer in the end a different way of imagining politics, particularly a society like the United States, where you have so many different identity groups. Instead of us basing our sort of movement in the world, our political movements, based on this zero-sum idea, we can actually base it on the very opposite of that idea, which is to say, as that other group gains, my group gains. And because that other group, because we both gain together, I actually need to build political solidarity with that other group. Because the more we build political solidarity, the more powerful we become. And the more powerful we become, the better ability we have to take on the oligarchs. And so I actually call that construct the chain of humanity, that we are all fundamentally linked. And the weakest link, and so the way that operates on a very practical level is I think it's critically important for everyone in here to ensure that your own group is not facing a specific form of racism or sexism or ableism, but it's also important for us to figure out ways to build solidarity in political campaigns with people who are fighting different forms of oppression. And so how can I, with my own group, think about everyday ways to do that. And that even involves, I'm a student of anti-Black racism, but I'm constantly trying to learn about other forms of bigotry.
Thank you for all of these thoughts. And you mentioned, you were talking about how pre-World War II, that, you know, neo-Nazism actually came from an idea that circulated or came into being in 1916. And that then the Nazis basically took hold of that, and they basically, pulled the world into this world war. And as you talk about the similarities and the parallels to where we are today, and how neo-Nazism and what that looks like now, and the Great Replacement Theory and what that looks like now, do you feel, or do you think that we are currently existing in this drumbeat towards another world war? And given how these ideas they're becoming more and more ingrained in our society. There's a lot of the things that happened before World War II are happening now. If we are, what do you think? How can we stop ourselves?
So I do think that we are headed to that. It's interesting because it's another idea that I talk about in the epilogue. So these two sisters had sort of similar ideas, and I argue that in the end, that the grand political struggle of the 21st century is not between sort of the left or the right. And the reason why I say that is because, as many of you'll see through the survey data, there's a lot of people who identify as leftists who believe certain forms of Great Replacement Theory. And the polling data shows that not only in the United States, but around the world. It is not just folks who are Republicans who, when a Black person is hired at their job, they feel that that person or Black people are taking from them, right? And so I mention that because I argue in the end that the grand political struggle of the 21st century is between anti-racist democracy and racist dictatorship. And so in 10 years and 20 years, we either are going to have likely built one or the other. And humanity right now, for instance, of humanity is living within authoritarian states, just so we can understand the scale of authoritarianism, right now. Now, of course, there's a pretty significant democracy movement around the world and even this country, but you have even people in this country who somehow imagine that you can engage in a movement for democracy and not talk about race and not talk about gender. I mean, it's just maddening when your literal opponents are using those ideas to clamor for power. And I think that is creating all sorts of challenges, because you have people who are fighting for democracy only in theory. Because if you're not truly fighting for anti-racism, you're actually not fighting for democracy.
I'm a little bit confused, because I think that people who have privileges think they have power, and they don't want to. They like their power, and they have no intention of giving it up. So, and it seems like people always want power. So I don't know. I don't really understand how you address the difference between privileges and power.
So I actually wrote about that in the prologue, and I'm literally looking for it. No, I'm literally looking for it. And the reason being is because before writing this book, I think like distinguished power and but in this book, I thought it was critically important for us to understand the relationship between power and privilege. And frankly, hopefully people who read this book, I actually write that this is frankly a book. This is a history of power, chaining privileged people by their own ideas. And I try to distinguish what it means to be people who are powerful and people who have privilege. And to give one, y'all mind if I read a quick passage? So I write, when I'm talking about this relationship, I say this resembles the political dynamics back in 1860, when white American enslavers and their financiers on Wall Street reigned as one of the richest and most powerful oligarchies in the world. Everyday white Southerners had the privilege of not being enslaved. Many worked as overseers in one way or another, lording over enslaved Black people. But a white overseer's authority was conditional. The condition, submitting to the white master who lorded over him and the enslaved. The white master dominated the government, the economy, the cultural infrastructure, which is to say the white master dominated the white overseer. To chain another, the white overseer had to accept his own chains, then and now. He spent his lifetime policing the law and order of racial hierarchy that subordinated him, white elites over everyday white people, over Black people. The white overseer, who rarely became a super wealthy enslaver, spent his lifetime preserving his privilege and his subordination. Great replacement theory manipulates white people into believing that their domination is fleeting at the hands of democracy. But in fact, these movements remove their privileges and their subordination. Everyday white people, men, Christians, middle-income people, ethnic majorities, and members of privileged groups, not dominant groups. Yes, members of privileged groups are empowered to oppress, to exploit, to kill, to dominate, as their disadvantaged victims know all too well. But to identify these privileged people as members of dominant groups is to conceal who empowers them, the truly dominant group of oligarchs. To identify privileged people as dominant is to conceal that most of us, because I'm a man, gain privileges in exchange for submitting to our own domination. When we believe we are dominant as opposed to privileged, we defend our privileges as if we are defending our domination over others. But in actuality, we are defending the domination of others over us.
Hi. I'm sick of this topic, but I feel like it's pertinent. But artificial intelligence, not your. All right. Artificial intelligence is what I mean. Sorry, artificial intelligence is it's a topic that I have to educate students about and the ethics behind it, and it concerns me that it's a tool owned by oligarchs, and it's put out, and it's being widely used and widely integrated into our systems. And I understand that there's bias within the data, but how do you see it as something to be watchful of, since it is a tool of oligarchs who have the power and what do we need to be looking out for?
Well, what's interesting about, I'm happy you brought up what I call human artificial intelligence, because of course all the biases are baked in. What's striking about this in relation to this text is we're living in a world in which so many people in this country and other countries believe that Black people or immigrants or women are taking their jobs when AI is taking their jobs. They believe that these disadvantaged groups are stealing their taxpayer money when AI is stealing their taxpayer money, right? They believe that their communities are being overrun and invaded by folks of color. Data centers are literally invading and overrunning their communities, right? And so it gives us another way to see how great replacement theory is a distraction, right? Distracting from the imperialism that is AI, frankly. But that is what propagandists have long done, right? They distract us from the real issues, the real problems, and get us sort of running in circles, thinking we're going somewhere.
Hi, thank you. I feel like that connects really well to, I was wondering about how all these things connect to perhaps the overarching ideas of like literacy crisis, and then the idea that people are both informally and formally either accepting or being perhaps changes to curriculum, but they also more of words and allowing people to go on continuing watering down definitions and accepting that. How do you think all of these kind of micro and macro word games factor into?
Okay. So one is that Renaud Camus writes at one point that he is against what he calls the democratization of education. He does not believe that we are all capable of particularly higher education. So similar to the Cockness guy who believes that if there was a true meritocracy, there'd be no black students or faculty. Camus believes when presented with the data that the great replacement is not happening. And when I say that, for instance, in Europe, 91% of European residents right now were born in the European Union. In the United States, with the largest foreign-born population in the world, 86% of residents were born in the United States. When you read people these data, his response is, if the data, and frankly, if science does not show that the great replacement is happening, then that doesn't mean there's an issue with the great replacement. That means there's an issue with data and science. And then he says, particularly to white people, forget the data. Why? If you feel it's happening, so these people are deeply anti-science. They're deeply anti-intellectual. And in terms of sort of the playing with words, in the book, I write about what I call the inversion of anti-racism. And as many of you have seen over the last six years in particular, there's been many commentators who framed anti-racism as anti-white. Anybody heard that, seen that? Okay. And that's happened before that, right? You have people who frame, and it even extends anti, public education, are attacking science, are undermining higher education, right? Because it's similar to what enslavers did, in which they simultaneously made it illegal for Black people to read and write, because they recognized that a person who was literate would be more likely to rebel, would be more likely to be able to find their way to Florida, or find their way to Philadelphia, or find their way over to Mexico. You had old Black folks running to Mexico. I'll stop.
I believe I saw another hand over here.
Hi. What did you learn in writing the book about the advisors? Because most of us understand that the person in power has an advisor who is stringing together these ideas and these plans. What did you learn about who the leading advisors are in the world from this? And are these oligarchs actually following a playbook? Or how are they finding their way to leading this around?
So I think probably many of you have heard of Trump's main advisor on great replacement theory. Anybody want to shout his name? Stephen Miller. Yes, Stephen Miller, right? And other authoritarian leaders have advisors who of similar sort of stature. In Chain of Ideas, I write about the distinction between a great replacement politician, these are the politicians who are expressing, and great replacement theorists. And these are the Stephen Millers. These are the people who are coining or renovating or popularizing that particular country's form or brand, of great replacement theorists, great replacement theory. And so certainly each of these people have key advisors, but they may not even be literally in the White House, right? They just may have a major show like Tucker Carlson Tonight, in which they spend hundreds of hours over years pushing great replacement theory, as Tucker Carlson did, which was, of course, the #1 show, cable news show, when he was there, and frankly, and so that certainly is happening, and they also have a playbook. One of the early ideas we were thinking about for a title was actually the playbook, right? Because in many ways we showed the playbook politicians use.
Hello. I had two questions. One is, do you think as human beings will ever learn from history? Are we just doomed to repeat it? And two, the playbook that you mentioned, which puts people pinned against each other, thinking that, my success depends on your failure, or your success means it's my failure. How do we protect ourselves from that type of fear, where we don't see lack, from a lack of thinking, rather an abundant world where we can all succeed? Like, your failure doesn't mean my success, and so forth. How do we protect ourselves from that? Because that's the easy way to be cracked into our mindset, into thinking easily. Like, I can be for the community, but the minute I'm put in a place where I'm thinking I might lose, then before I know it, I've changed as a humanity myself.
So I think that one of the ways ourselves is by seeing and coming to understand the big picture, right? And that is why, and frankly, who is telling us that idea and why? And that's one of the reasons why I decided to not only write about the emergence of great replacement theory in the United States, but around the whole world. I wanted people to have a seismic understanding of these ideas that they are being told on a daily basis. And I wanted people to see the carnage and the plunder that these people who are expressing these ideas in other countries like our own, have done. And so my hope is that, it's one thing, right? Y'all mind if I use a bad analogy? Right. It's one thing, let's say, I'm sure some of you, if not most of you, if not all of us, there's been a time in which we had a friend and that friend, we get on the phone with them. We know they're just going to talk something about something. They're going to spill the tea. And on this particular day, they tell us that such and such do not like us, right? And this is a person we actually helped, right? But they're just spilling the tea that this person does not like us, and this is what they were saying about us, and they're getting us all riled up, right? And that's all we know in that moment, right? That's all we know is what our friend is telling us. But what if we know that they actually don't like us being friends with that other person because they want us for themselves? What if we know the bigger picture? While they're saying this to us, right? It's going to be far and away less likely for them to be able to manipulate our behavior and to chain us by our own ideas.
Okay, at the risk of pointing you back to your prologue or epilogue, two-part question. One, can you talk at all about, in the genesis of the idea of this book, how much of the impetus to write this book was something that was maybe a long-standing idea for you versus something that maybe had a specific genesis as a specific, perhaps recent point in time? In part two, or maybe I'll just wait. or part two is...
Yeah, you should probably...
Yeah, I should probably...
So I'll say very quickly, it was interesting. I think if you read this book and then go back and read the white chapter in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think you'll see a genesis. And to give one example, at one point in the white chapter, I say something to the effect, I explain, because in that chapter, I'm talking about how when you actually look at the history of people who have been expressing and championing these white supremacist ideas, whether it was Confederates or Nazi Germany, when you actually look at the everyday lives of regular white folks who these individuals were claiming they were seeking to protect and elevate, it was actually pretty bad, right? And I sort of talk about other things in that sense, and I ultimately argue that what's striking is that when you actually look at the material effects of anti-Blackness on white people, it's actually quite anti-white. There's an author who wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness, in which he clinically showed how white people who hold anti-Black racist ideas, particularly those who believe things like, I don't want to support Medicare for all because that means those Black people are going to get it. What does that also mean? You ain't gonna get it, right? And so, or even Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, in which she writes about how you had these white folks who were so opposed to desegregation that they were willing to essentially fill in their pools. Right, so because you didn't want Black folks sleep, going because they thought it was going to be sleeping with them, right? But because you didn't want Black folks to be swimming with your children now can't swim at all, right? Or because during, as Heather McGee documents in The Sum of Us, early when they created these subprime mortgages, when they were preying on Black homeowners, and when advocates of Black communities were like, this is predatory, this is a problem. But because you had folks who were so racist, they didn't care about what was happening to Black folks. What happened? What happened to those subprime mortgages? They spread like a virus and then hit white America, right? And so there are all these examples in history that really shows. And so I didn't mean to I told you I was going to be brief, my bad. But but I think there's a relationship there.
And then just very quickly, what was the most salient, perhaps surprising thing that at the conclusion of this exercise of writing this book that emerged in your mind?
I think the ultimate argument of the book, I ultimately argue that great replacement theory has become the most dominant political theory of our time. And I make that case, and again, I'm specifically saying political theory, which is different than political philosophy like conservatism, but political theory, I make that case based on polling data in terms of the number of people around the world who believe aspects of this theory, critical masses as much as 30% of the world, the number of prime ministers and presidents and ruling parties and ruling opposition or leading opposition figures who are expressing great replacement theory, the way in which it's mutated. Racist theory is an Islamophobic theory, and it's a sexist theory, and it's a homophobic and transphobic theory, and even the way in which it's instigated mass shootings in this country, in El Paso, in Buffalo, in Charleston, in Pittsburgh, in which you had these typically younger white men imagining that white people were facing annihilation, so they went and picked up their guns and decided they were going to open fire on people who were having a Bible study in Charleston, South Carolina. And you've had this massive surge in terror attacks by people who believe what's called white genocide theory. But then not only that, it's mass shootings, but then even genocide. The genocide in Gaza was justified on great replacement theory. Even war, right? Invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The battle between Iran and US was presented as this civilizational battle because apparently Islam is engaging in civilizational erasure, to use the Secretary of State's term. And so I was not expecting that, right? But the research and the evidence ultimately forced me to make that case.
And we have time for about one more question before we transfer into our book signing, where you all will have an opportunity to ask the rest of your questions. We'll go over here. Here you are.
Thank you so much. So my question's about your energy. So thank you for bringing your energy here today. You've written several books. These are heavy topics. I'm very impressed. I'm sure the room is as well. How do you rebound on your energy? And what would you suggest to everyone else that cares to motivate their peers, their towns, their populations, but they're tired?
Well, I think it's important for each of us to recognize that we are kind of mortal. We're kind of human, right? We can only do so much. We have certain skills and talents, right? And we can certainly dedicate our skills and talents, to this struggle. At the same time, we have to be one with our body and be able to have a sense of when we're doing too much, and have the ability to unplug, to rest, right? And to not feel somebody who I have to push myself to do all those things, right? But I also know that we're facing a force that is literally trying to overwhelm us. That's part of for instance, there was a few scholars that call Russian disinformation, which the way they engaged in disinformation was replicated in our country and other countries. They called Russian disinformation a fire hose of falsehoods. because they wanted people to, like a fire hose, just constantly sort of coming at you and overwhelming you, right? And so part of it is so that we will disconnect from our process.
Available for sale tonight, and you will have an opportunity to get them signed. Now we are going to transition into our book signing, which will be taking place in the bookstore in the front of the restaurant. If you all would like to give us a brief moment so that we can make that transition and let Dr. Kendi get settled. While we are doing that, please close out your tabs with your waiter and make sure that you have all of your belongings. Thank you all again, and I'll be back with a brief announcement when we're ready to make that move. Thank you.